The wrench slipped from Sergeant William Henderson's grease, stained fingers, clattering against the cobblestones of the quayside. He didn't bother to pick it up. His attention was fixed, utterly consumed, by the scene unfolding before him in the pale dawn light of Cherbourg harbour. A convoy was forming, a river of olive drab steel that snaked through the shattered port, out past the bomb, cratered perimeter, and onto the roads leading east. It was a sight that stretched the limits of belief. 6,000 trucks. The British had said it couldn't be done. They'd said the design was flawed, underpowered, a mechanical dead end, worthless for the brutal realities of modern warfare. And yet, here they were, engines coughing to life, a low rumble building into a deafening roar that shook the very ground. Men, 3/4 of them American, climbed warily into the cabs, their faces already etched with a fatigue that had little to do with the hour. Their journey hadn't even begun, and they were already exhausted. For these men, the letters GMC stamped on each hood stood for more than General Motors Corporation. They were a promise, a fragile covenant. They meant survival. They meant the difference between a bullet finding its mark or a gun falling silent. They meant the thin, steel thread of a lifeline that would either hold and pull the Allied armies forward to Germany or snap and leave them stranded in the French countryside. What none of them could have known on that misty August morning was that this truck, this humble, maligned vehicle, would prove more decisive than the mightiest tank, more crucial than the fastest fighter plane, more essential than any single weapon system in the entire European theatre. The unassuming 2.5-ton GMC CCKW, the Jimmy, the Deuce and a half, was about to inscribe its name into history not with a flash of glory, but with the grinding, relentless determination of the most desperate supply operation the world had ever witnessed. The story begins not in the chaos of war, torn France, but in the quiet, ordered design rooms of General Motors in 1939. The United States Army Ordnance Corps had circulated a specification sheet for a new medium tactical truck. The requirements were clear, if demanding. A vehicle rated for 2.5 tons, with 6-wheel drive capability, engineered to operate off-road in any weather, anywhere in the world. On paper, it seemed straightforward. The solution, however, would prove to be anything but. The engineers at GM's Truck and Coach Division in Pontiac, Michigan, approached the problem with a pragmatic, American sensibility. They took their existing, proven AC series commercial truck design and began re-engineering it for war. Critical modifications were made. A second rear axle was added for improved traction and load distribution. An all-wheel drive system was engineered for off-road capability. The frame rails were strengthened and reinforced to handle the punishing loads of military service. The result was designated the CCKW 353, the direct, if imperfect, predecessor to the legendary CCKW. This initial design was powered by a GMC 248 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder engine that produced a modest 77 horsepower. The trucks weighed in at 956 pounds empty and measured 264 inches long, 94.5 inches wide and 118 inches tall. By the comfortable standards of American commercial hauling, they were adequate. By the unforgiving metrics of military necessity, they were questionable at best. France, desperate for modern equipment as war clouds gathered, placed an order for 1,000 of these experimental 656 trucks in late 1939. Production began at the Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company's facilities. These early trucks featured closed steel cabs, fixed bed sides, and conventional styling that wouldn't have looked out of place on a civilian construction site. They were, in essence, commercial trucks dressed in military uniform. Then came the catastrophe that changed everything. In May of 1940, German panzer divisions smashed through the Ardennes forest, bypassing the Maginot Line and driving deep into the heart of France. The French army, equipped with some of the most advanced tanks and fortifications in Europe, collapsed under the sheer speed and coordination of the German blitzkrieg. The British Expeditionary Force was hurled back to the beaches of Dunkirk. France fell in a stunning 6 weeks. 2,000 of the ACKWX trucks had already been delivered. They were captured in their depots by advancing German forces and would ironically go on to serve the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, where German soldiers, despite themselves, grudgingly admitted their reliability. The remainder of the French order, along with additional units still on the production line, was diverted to Great Britain under emergency wartime contracts. The British Army took delivery of the ACKWX trucks in the summer of 1940, during Britain's darkest hour, and immediately subjected them to the most rigorous testing. Their reports, preserved in military archives, were damning. The wheelbase was too long for narrow European roads and trails, making the trucks difficult to maneuver in tight spaces. The 77-horsepower engine was critically underpowered for the vehicle's considerable weight, especially when fully laden. Acceleration was poor, hill climbing ability marginal. Despite the 6-wheel drive, the trucks struggled in mud and soft terrain. British Army officials concluded the ACKWX was unsuitable for modern mechanized warfare. They deemed the design fundamentally flawed. Rather than commit these trucks to combat use, where British lives might depend on their performance, the War Office made a decisive judgment. They diverted approximately 1,000 units to the Soviet Union under the nascent Lend-Lease agreements in 1941. A total of 466 ACKWX trucks were built across all recipients. The British rejection appeared to validate the deepest concerns of military traditionalists, that American truck manufacturers, accustomed to wide highways and gentle terrain, simply could not produce a vehicle suitable for the brutal realities of European warfare. Stung by this assessment, General Motors engineers returned to their drawing boards. The lessons from the ACKWX experience were clear. More power was essential. The chassis required refinement. The wheelbase needed options for different missions. But the fundamental concept, a 6x6 medium tactical truck built from robust commercial components for rapid mass production, remained sound. The American engineers understood something their British colleagues, focused on perfecting a machine for a specific set of conditions, had perhaps overlooked. This was not about building the perfect truck. This was about building an adequate truck in numbers so vast they would overwhelm any enemy through sheer industrial capacity and logistical might. In 1941, General Motors introduced the redesigned version, designated the CCKW. The nomenclature came from GMC's internal coding system C, for designed in 1941. The second C for conventional cab design, K for all-wheel drive, and RW for dual tandem rear axles. The improvements over the ACKWX were substantial, if not revolutionary. The new GMC 270 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder engine replaced the anemic 248, producing 104 horsepower at 750 RPM. A 27 horsepower increase might not sound dramatic, but it transformed the truck's character. The engine delivered 216 foot-pounds of torque at a low 400 RPM, providing the grunting, low-end power essential for hauling heavy loads up steep grades. The engineers also designed 2 wheelbase options into the core design. The CCKW 352 with a 145-inch wheelbase served as a short, nimble variant for artillery prime mover duties. The CCKW 353 with a 164-inch wheelbase became the standard, long bed cargo configuration. This flexibility allowed the same basic truck to fill dozens of different roles across the entire spectrum of combat units. The frame was a straightforward ladder design with riveted crossmembers, simple to manufacture and easy to repair in the field. 3-beam axles, all driven, provided the 656 capability. The front axle was mounted on leaf springs, while the rear tandem used leaf springs with locating arms to control axle movement. The brakes were hydraulic with vacuum assist, a significant improvement over older mechanical systems. The tyres were 7.50/20, providing a reasonable compromise between ground clearance and load capacity. Initial production models retained the closed metal cab from the CCKWX design. But as war production accelerated into a national crusade and steel became a rationed strategic material, GMC engineers made a critical, war-winning decision. Beginning in July 1943, new CCKW trucks began rolling off the lines with open cabs featuring canvas tops and removable doors. This change saved approximately 150 pounds of steel per vehicle. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of trucks, and the steel savings became immense, enough to build entire flotillas of destroyers or entire battalions of tanks. The cargo bed went through its own evolution, driven by the same relentless material constraints. Early trucks had all steel beds, which proved durable but heavy. These were replaced by wooden beds, which warped and cracked under military loads. A composite design with steel framing and wooden floor slats was tried, and also proved inadequate. The final design returned to a simplified, all-steel construction that reduced material waste while maintaining the necessary durability under brutal conditions. What emerged from this process of refinement was not a technological marvel, but a masterpiece of pragmatic design. The CCKW would never win races. It would never impress engineers with its sophistication. But it could be built in enormous numbers by skilled workers using available materials. And, most importantly, it could be repaired in field conditions by mechanics with basic tools and limited training. This was its genius. General Motors placed the primary production contract with the yellow truck and coach facility in Pontiac, Michigan. As orders multiplied exponentially, Chevrolet's St. Louis, Missouri plant was brought into the production fold. At peak output, these two facilities were completing one CCKW truck every 7 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The assembly lines never stopped. The manufacturing process itself was a breathtaking display of American industrial might. Raw materials entered one end of the vast Pontiac plant, and finished trucks, painted in olive drab, rolled out the other. Sheet metal was stamped into fenders and hoods. Frames were welded and riveted together. Engines were assembled from hundreds of precision, machined components. Transmissions, axles, and suspension systems were built in separate facilities and shipped to the final assembly lines. The entire operation employed tens of thousands of workers. A vast army of production, many of them women. Rosie the riveters, who had entered the industrial workforce to replace the men serving in combat overseas. The production numbers tell the story of this unprecedented industrial mobilization. From 1941 through 1945, General Motors manufactured approximately 562 750 CCKW trucks across all variants. This figure includes specialized versions, but the standard production models alone totaled between 518,000 and 519,000 units. To grasp the scale of this achievement, one must consider that Germany, for the entire war, produced approximately 100,000 total trucks of all types. The Soviet Union, despite massive American lease aid that included hundreds of thousands of vehicles, manufactured fewer than 200,000 trucks of their own. Great Britain's entire wartime truck production was utterly dwarfed by this single American model. The CCKW alone nearly equaled the combined truck production of all the Axis powers. The CCKW spawned dozens of specialized variants, a testament to its versatile chassis. There were dump trucks for engineer units building bridges and airstrips, tankers for transporting precious fuel and water, mobile workshops equipped with lathes and welding gear for field repairs, communications vans housing complex radio equipment, ambulances outfitted with medical supplies and stretcher racks, wrecker trucks with powerful cranes for recovering disabled vehicles, anti-aircraft platforms mounting fearsome quadruple, 50 caliber machine guns. Each variant used the same basic chassis, engine, and drivetrain. A standardization that dramatically simplified maintenance and spare parts logistics across the entire theatre of war. But numbers and variants mean nothing without application, and in the summer of 1944, the CCKW faced its ultimate test. This test would not come from German 8A Bunnerman anti-tank guns or strafing Luftwaffe fighters. It would come from the simple, unyielding laws of physics, from the tyranny of distance and the cold, hard mathematics of supply. June 6, 1944. Over 150 Zeus and Allied soldiers stormed ashore on 5 Normandy beaches. The largest amphibious invasion in history had achieved tactical surprise and established a fragile lodgment on Hitler's Atlantic Wall. But a lodgment is not victory. By mid-July, more than 1 million Allied troops were crammed into a pocket approximately 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep. They were going nowhere. The Germans had masterfully turned the Norman countryside into a defensive nightmare. The bocage, ancient hedgerows, thick walls of earth and vegetation dating back centuries, divided the landscape into thousands of small, enclosed fields. Each hedgerow was a ready, made defensive position for German machine guns and anti-tank weapons. Each field became a separate, bloody battle. American infantry and armor bled their way through this deadly maze at a horrific cost, gaining yards instead of miles. Then came Operation Cobra. On July 25, 1944, American forces launched a massive breakout attempt, preceded by a devastating saturation bombing that pulverized German front line positions. Within days, the German defensive lines cracked. American armored divisions, like coiled springs suddenly released, poured through the breach. By early August, General George Patton's Third Army was unleashed, racing across open French countryside at a pace that stunned the world. They were covering 50, 60, sometimes 80 miles per day. This thunderous advance threatened to trap and destroy entire German armies in a giant pincer movement. But Patton's tankers soon faced an enemy more dangerous and implacable than any panzer division. They were running out of fuel. Each M4 Sherman tank consumed approximately 150 gallons of gasoline per 100 miles of travel. An armored division with roughly 250 tanks burned through massive quantities of fuel during a rapid advance. Add in the division's trucks, jeeps, and other support vehicles, and the fuel consumption reached staggering levels. Patton commanded multiple divisions, spread across hundreds of miles of front. His fuel requirements alone exceeded 400,000 gallons daily. The First Army needed similar amounts. The British and Canadian forces required their own extensive supply lines. Total Allied fuel consumption in early August 1944 exceeded 3 million gallons per day. The Allies had planned for a rapid advance. They had prepared supply depots and established logistics networks, but no one, not even the most optimistic planner, had anticipated a breakthrough this dramatic and fast-moving. Within 2 weeks of the Cobra breakout, American spearheads were 200 miles from the Normandy beaches. Within a month, lead elements were approaching 350 miles from their supply bases. Every single gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every can of sea rations, had to travel that immense distance over war, damaged roads, through a French transportation network that Allied bombing had systematically destroyed in the months before D-Day. The destruction of the French railroads had been deliberate, and in a cruel twist of fate, too successful. To prevent German reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches, Allied air forces had spent April, May, and June of 1944 systematically bombing every railroad yard, bridge, and marshalling centre within 200 miles of Normandy. The campaign succeeded brilliantly. German panzer divisions took weeks to reach the front instead of days. But those same shattered railroads could not now be used to supply the Allied armies racing toward Germany. The Mulberry Harbours, those incredible artificial ports towed across the English Channel, had sustained the invasion force through June and July. But a massive storm in mid-June had utterly destroyed the American Mulberry. The British Mulberry at Arromanches remained operational, but it could not possibly handle the colossal tonnage requirements of two entire army groups. Cherbourg had been captured, but its port facilities were so thoroughly demolished by German engineers that restoration would take months. In late August 1944, the American High Command faced a catastrophic paradox. They had achieved an unprecedented military victory on the battlefield, only to be on the verge of a logistical collapse. Patton's tanks were running dry 300 miles from their supply bases. The First Army was rationing artillery ammunition. The entire combat effectiveness of the Allied forces hung by a fraying thread. Without an immediate, massive resupply, the great advance would stall, and German forces would be granted precious time to consolidate new defensive lines. The opportunity to end the war in 1944 would be lost. On August 21, 1944, American logistics officers held an emergency planning conference. 36 hours of non-stop, caffeine-fueled meetings produced a solution so desperate, so audacious, that it could only have been conceived by Americans, raised on the scale of transcontinental highways and massive trucking networks. They would create a dedicated, express convoy system, a military version of a priority freight train network. They would press every available truck into continuous, non-stop service. 2 one-way routes would be established from the Normandy depots to forward supply points. All civilian traffic would be banned. Military police would control every intersection to ensure the convoys never, ever stopped. The plan required more trucks than any single command possessed. Within hours, logistics officers began a ruthless scavenger hunt, stripping trucks from every non-critical unit in the European theatre. Artillery battalions gave up their prime movers. Engineer units surrendered their construction equipment haulers. Medical companies released ambulances. Infantry divisions lost their organic transportation. Every truck capable of rolling under its own power was drafted into the new operation. The primary vehicle, the backbone of this desperate gamble, was the GMC CCKW. By August 1944, tens of thousands of these trucks had been shipped to Europe. They sat in motor pools, parked at supply depots, scattered across the rear areas. Now they were marshalled for the greatest truck convoy in human history. 6,000 vehicles were assembled for the initial push. Later, that number would peak at nearly 6,000 trucks on the road simultaneously. But trucks need drivers, and here, America's deep-seated racism created both a crisis and an unexpected opportunity. The United States Army in 1944 remained strictly segregated by race. African American soldiers served in separate units under almost exclusively white officers. Military policy, rooted in vile racist assumptions, held that black soldiers lacked the intelligence, courage, and discipline for combat roles. Therefore, African Americans were assigned primarily to service units, quartermaster companies, port battalions, and transportation units. They were truck drivers, stevedores, and labourers. In August 1944, the European theatre contained approximately 200,000 African American soldiers. Nearly half of them, about 93,000 men, served in the Quartermaster Corps. When the call went out for truck drivers for this new, critical mission, these men answered. They did not answer because they wanted to drive a truck for 60 hours straight without sleep. They did not answer because they enjoyed being segregated and discriminated against while fighting for freedom abroad. They answered because their country, in its moment of dire need, called upon them. They answered because the lives of combat troops, white troops, depended on them. And they answered because American soldiers understood, with a profound and painful clarity, that serving with distinction in a critical role was a powerful way to advance the cause of civil rights back home. 17,000 American soldiers became Red Ball Express drivers. An additional 3 Zaros and white soldiers joined them. Though in practice the operation remained largely segregated, with black and white units often running separate convoys. The drivers ranged in age from 18 to 40, though most were young men under 24. Many had never driven a truck before entering military service. Some came from inner, city neighborhoods where nobody owned a car. They received hasty, abbreviated training, sometimes just a few days, before being declared qualified to drive a 2.5-ton military truck loaded with 5 tons of high explosives or volatile gasoline through active combat zones. The African American soldiers who became Red Ball Express drivers came from every corner of a segregated America. There were farm boys from Mississippi who had driven tractors but never trucks of this size. Factory workers from Detroit who knew assembly lines but not military logistics. College students whose educations had been interrupted by the draft. Sharecroppers as sons seeking opportunities far better than the rigid, oppressive system of the Jim Crow South could ever offer. They were men who had faced discrimination and hatred their entire lives, now finding themselves entrusted with the most critical supply mission of the entire war in Europe. The Red Ball Express began operation on August 25, 1944. The name was borrowed from railroad terminology dating to the late 1800s. Railroad companies marked priority express freight cars with a red ball, signaling to all other traffic to yield the right of way. Now, red balls appeared on signs marking the dedicated truck routes across France. Red balls were painted on the hoods and front bumpers of the trucks, identifying them as convoy vehicles. The Red Ball Express was born. The system was brilliantly simple in concept, though hellishly difficult in execution. 2 parallel one-way routes connected the Normandy ports to forward supply depots. The northern route carried loaded trucks east toward the front. The southern route returned empty trucks to Normandy, often carrying German prisoners of war westward as backhaul cargo. The total route length eventually stretched to nearly 400 miles as the front line relentlessly moved east. Convoys officially consisted of at least 5 trucks, with jeep escorts at the front and rear. Trucks were ordered to maintain 60-yard intervals and a maximum speed of 25 miles per hour. In reality, these rules were often the first casualty of the desperate need for speed. Individual trucks often departed as soon as they were loaded, without waiting for convoy formation. Speed limits became mere suggestions. Drivers, knowing that minutes could mean lives, would remove or disable the engine governors, pushing the hard, working CCKW trucks well past their designed 56 mph maximum. Some veterans reported pushing their jimmies to speeds exceeding 60 mph, a terrifying velocity in a top, heavy 2.5-ton truck with 1940s era suspension, bias, ply tires, and rudimentary brakes. The 793rd Military Police Battalion was tasked with providing route security and traffic control. MPs manned every major intersection, their whistles and flags ensuring that Red Ball convoys never, ever stopped for cross traffic. They directed lost drivers, reported accidents, and fought a constant, losing battle against rampant speed limit violations. Some MPs, finding their jeeps too slow to keep up with the speeding trucks, took to riding shotgun in the cabs of the CCKWs themselves. Each round trip took approximately 54 hours as the front moved farther and farther east. 2-man driver teams were supposed to share duties, though in practice, both men often stayed awake for entire runs, one driving while the other navigated and watched for threats. The trucks carried everything forward to the fighting men. 5 gallon jerry cans of gasoline, stacked high and perilously, ammunition in heavy wooden crates, food rations in cardboard boxes, medical supplies in sterile packages, spare parts for tanks and jeeps, mail from home, the most precious cargo of all, and occasionally unofficial cargo, including black market items and personal packages, found its way onto the trucks. The loading operations at Cherbourg and other Normandy ports ran 24 hours a day. Stevedores, many of them also African-American, worked with a brutal, relentless efficiency. A CCKW could be loaded with its 5 tons of cargo in under 10 minutes. Drivers would sign for their loads, receive their route instructions, and immediately roll out toward the thunder of the front. No rest stops, no delays. The order was simple and absolute. Keep them rolling. The journey itself was an ordeal that would violate 100 modern safety regulations. Drivers operated in total blackout conditions at night, using tiny, cat's eye, blackout lights that provided barely enough illumination to see the edge of the road. They navigated by memory, by following the dim silhouette of the truck ahead, by sheer instinct. The roads were often cratered from bombing or shelling. Bridges were damaged or destroyed, requiring long, unmarked detours through unfamiliar countryside. Getting lost meant burning precious fuel and delaying critical supplies, a sin of the highest order. German air attacks, though increasingly rare as the Luftwaffe was bled white, remained a persistent threat. The Germans could still mount occasional, desperate raids, and a long, slow-moving convoy of trucks made a fat, tempting target. Drivers learned to watch the sky, to listen for the distinctive, low-pitched growl of German aircraft engines, to scatter their trucks off the road and into fields when air raid warnings sounded. Some trucks mounted 50 caliber machine guns on ring mounts above the passenger seat, though these provided more psychological reassurance than effective defense against a strafing fighter plane. Landmines posed a constant, invisible danger. German forces in their retreat sowed mines in road shoulders and likely parking areas. Some were sophisticated, pressure-triggered devices. Others were crude. Buried artillery shells or captured munitions, wired to detonate under the weight of a vehicle. Red Ball drivers quickly learned the life-saving discipline of staying strictly on the pavement, of parking only in areas that had been cleared by engineers, of watching for any sign of disturbed earth or a suspicious object. But the greatest enemy, the one that wore down even the bravest men, was fatigue. The drivers pushed themselves far past normal human limits, sustained by bitter, strong coffee and sheer determination. Some drivers took Benzedrine tablets, amphetamines issued by medical officers to combat exhaustion, though this practice was officially discouraged. The drugs kept men awake but clouded their judgment, leading to accidents. Many drivers, distrusting the pep pills, relied instead on caffeine, nicotine, and raw willpower to stay alert during these marathon runs. Accidents became terrifyingly common. Trucks collided in the inky darkness. They overturned on sharp curves taken at too high a speed. They crashed into obstacles hidden by the night. Drivers, despite their best efforts, would simply fall asleep at the wheel, their vehicles drifting off the road. Some of these accidents were fatal. The army assigned relief drivers to ride in the passenger seats, tasked with taking over when the primary driver could no longer function safely. Even with this measure, the toll of exhaustion was relentless. The trucks themselves suffered a kind of mechanical agony. The CCKW was designed for rugged military use, but the continuous, non-stop operation of the Red Ball Express, without proper maintenance and under maximum loads, exceeded any design specification ever conceived. Engines overheated in the late summer heat while hauling maximum loads at high speed. Transmissions, abused by frantic gear shifting, failed. Clutches burned out from constant stop, and start driving in convoys. Brakes wore through their pads in days instead of months. Tires, subjected to overloading and high speeds on rough, shrapnel, littered roads, blew out with alarming frequency. Maintenance was performed under impossible conditions. Mechanics worked in the mud beside the roads, in fields, under tarps strung between two trucks. They had only basic tools, and whatever spare parts could be scrounged or salvaged. Many repairs were field expedient, good enough to get the truck moving again, but far from a proper rebuild. Oil changes were skipped. Scheduled maintenance was ignored. Everything was sacrificed on the altar of the single, overriding imperative, keep the trucks rolling. The mechanics, many of them African, American like the drivers, became absolute masters of improvisation. They fashioned new gaskets from scavenged leather or rubber. They bypassed broken fuel lines with sections of rubber hose. They cannibalized parts from one broken, down truck to get 3 others back on the road. The CCKW's simple, straightforward design made this possible. A mechanic with basic skills could diagnose most problems, identify the needed parts, and perform the repairs using whatever materials were at hand. This adaptability, born of desperate necessity, proved to be one of the truck's greatest, if unheralded, strengths. By late August, broken, down trucks littered the Red Ball roads like mechanical casualties. Some estimates suggest that over 80 vehicles were simply abandoned where they died when they could not be quickly repaired. Drivers would take what personal gear and valuable parts they could carry and hitch rides on passing convoys. Wrecker trucks worked continuously, tirelessly to recover disabled vehicles, but often they, too, broke down under the immense strain. At one point, nearly 30% of the Red Ball trucks had significant mechanical problems that should have removed them from service. But they kept rolling anyway, because the alternative was unthinkable. Yet, against all odds, against all projections, and the grim predictions of the skeptics, the operation succeeded. Within just 5 days of starting, the Red Ball Express hit its peak capacity. On August 29, 1944, a day that should be etched in the annals of military history, 132 truck pennies operating 5 958 vehicles delivered 12 342 tons of supplies to the forward depots. This single day's performance exceeded every pre-war estimate of what was logistically possible. The numbers continued to climb and hold at an astonishing level. Daily deliveries averaged between 10,000 and 12,500 tons. At any given moment, an average of 900 trucks were on the road, a continuous, rolling pipeline of sustenance for the fighting front. Over the 82 days of its official operation, the Red Ball Express drivers hauled a staggering 193 tons of supplies across the breadth of France. They drove 121 million ton miles, a figure that represents the sheer, colossal scale of the effort. The tonnage multiplied by the immense distance it travelled. They kept multiple army groups supplied during the most rapid and decisive advance in modern military history. Private James Rocard of the 514th Quartermaster Regiment later recalled the experience with a clarity undimmed by time. Were hauled anything General Patton needed. Gasoline, ammunition, food, medical supplies. We took it all the way to the front lines, back and forth. Back and forth. Some drivers ran into ambushes. My company was lucky, but there was shooting all around us. We had to watch for V1 buzz bombs. They would fly over and then their engines would cut out, and they'd drop like regular bombs. My worst memories were seeing trucks get blown up and being afraid I might get killed. But when General Patton said, "Be there," you were there, even if you had to drive all day and all night. Rocard's testimony captures the stark reality of the Red Ball operations. The constant, gnawing fear, the bone, deep exhaustion that made every mile feel like 10, the fierce pride in knowing their work mattered, and the iron determination to get through no matter the cost. His company made the run from Cherbourg to the forward depots dozens of times during those 82 days. They lost trucks to accidents, to mechanical failures, and to occasional enemy action, but they never failed to deliver their cargo. Corporal Washington Rector of the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company described the complex racial dynamics that existed even within this shared crucible. You accepted discrimination. We were warned not to fraternize with whites for fear problems would arise. Some white drivers would try to prevent black drivers from passing their convoys, creating dangerous road conditions. But most white combat troops appreciated us. They knew we were risking our lives to get them what they needed. Rector's account reveals the painful paradox at the heart of the Red Ball Express. Black and white units often operated separately, as mandated by the Army's segregation policy. When they did interact, the racism of American society often manifested in petty, yet dangerous, ways. White MPs might stop black drivers more frequently for minor infractions. White mess facilities might serve black drivers last, or not at all. White drivers might refuse to help black drivers with a mechanical problem on the side of the road. Yet, on those long, dangerous roads, when German shells began to fall, or when a truck broke down far from any help, the color of a man's skin often mattered less than the shared experience of survival. There were countless undocumented moments of humanity, of black and white drivers helping each other, despite the official policies of segregation. The trucks themselves became legendary among the men who drove them. The CCKW, they said, could take incredible abuse. You could overload them, overspeed them, skip maintenance, and they would keep running. Sure, they broke down a lot, one veteran recalled. The transmissions were weak. The brakes wore out fast, but you could fix them with basic tools. That's what mattered. A complicated truck that needed a factory to repair would have been useless. The Jimmy was simple. Simple meant it worked. The drivers developed a deep, almost intimate familiarity with their individual trucks. They learned the sound of every bearing, the feel of every gear, recognizing the subtle signs that something was about to fail. They knew precisely how hard they could push the engine before risking a catastrophic breakdown. They understood which problems could be ignored for another 100 miles and which required an immediate, desperate repair by the side of the road. This knowledge was born from spending days and nights behind the wheel, from performing their own roadside repairs, from pushing these machines to their absolute limits, and then discovering, time and again, that the limits were farther out than anyone had imagined. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express was delivering supplies to depots 350 miles from Normandy. The logistics became a nightmare of compounding complexity. Longer distances meant lower daily tonnage per truck as each vehicle could make fewer round trips. More and more trucks broke down from the accumulated strain of thousands of miles of punishing operation. Driver fatigue reached critical levels. The French railroad system, which teams of Allied engineers worked frantically to repair, remained largely inoperative. New ports, especially the vital deep water port of Antwerp in Belgium, were still in German hands or too badly damaged to use. The immense strain showed in every aspect of the operation. Accident rates climbed steadily. Some convoys were ambushed by bypassed German units that were still fighting desperate, isolated battles behind Allied lines. Theft became a significant problem as valuable cargo, gasoline, cigarettes, food rations began to disappear from trucks parked at makeshift rest stops. Some of these stolen goods found their way onto burgeoning black markets in newly liberated French cities like Paris. Drivers and cargo handlers faced accusations, often unfounded and tinged with racial prejudice, which only served to heighten the existing tensions. Military police investigated numerous incidents but rarely managed to recover the stolen materials. Yet through it all, the trucks kept rolling. They had to. General Patton's Third Army, the spearhead of the entire Allied advance, was consuming supplies at a rate that shocked even the most experienced logistics officers. His tankers were engaged in nearly continuous combat, expending ammunition at a prodigious rate. A single, sharp tank engagement could burn through a full combat load of shells, requiring immediate resupply from the rear. Patton's aggressive, headlong tactics generated spectacular results. They destroyed German divisions and captured vast swaths of territory. But they were only possible because the Red Ball Express kept his forces fueled, armed and fed. Patton himself, a man not known for effusive praise of support troops, recognized the operation's vital importance. Though famous for his bold armored maneuvers and fiery speeches, he understood with a soldier's clarity that logistics enabled everything. His tanks were worthless hunks of metal without gasoline. His artillery was silent without shells. His infantry was ineffective without food and ammunition. The Red Ball Express made his historic advance possible. Without it, the Third Army would have ground to an ignominious halt within weeks of the breakout, gifting German forces the precious time they needed to establish formidable new defensive lines that could have prolonged the war for many bloody months, perhaps even into 1946. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, also recognized the operation's monumental importance. In an October message directed specifically to the Red Ball Express personnel, he wrote, "To you drivers and mechanics and your officers who keep the Red Ball vehicles constantly moving, I wish to express my deep appreciation. You are doing an excellent job." Eisenhower understood military logistics better than most commanders of his rank. His experience planning and executing Operation Torch in North Africa had taught him the hard lesson that supply ultimately determined what operations were even possible. No amount of tactical brilliance or individual courage could overcome a logistical failure. The Red Ball Express represented military logistics at its most basic, its most essential, and its most heroic. It was about trucks, drivers, and roads. Nothing sophisticated, nothing glamorous. But it was absolutely, undeniably vital. Eisenhower's public recognition of the drivers' contribution was unusual for the era and reflected his genuine professional appreciation for this unglamorous but war-winning work. The contrast with German logistics during the same period was stark and telling. The Wehrmacht, despite its reputation as a modern, mechanized force, relied heavily on horse-drawn transport throughout the war. Germany employed more than 2.8 million horses during World War II to move its supplies and artillery. German truck production was severely limited by critical shortages of steel and rubber, and by a manufacturing capacity that was increasingly devoted to producing tanks and aircraft. When German mechanized units advanced, they frequently outran their own logistical support, a critical weakness that contributed significantly to their defeats in the vastness of Russia and the deserts of North Africa. In France in 1944, German forces faced a logistical nightmare of their own. Allied air superiority made daylight movement of supplies nearly suicidal. The French resistance sabotaged rail lines and ambushed supply convoys with devastating effectiveness. The Wehrmacht's reliance on a horse-drawn supply system, adequate perhaps for slow, set peace defensive operations, was completely incapable of supporting a war of rapid maneuver. German units often fought with severe ammunition shortages, inadequate food supplies, and a chronic lack of fuel. Captured German soldiers repeatedly told their Allied interrogators that American logistical superiority was as demoralizing and decisive as American superiority in firepower. By mid-November 1944, the strategic situation had changed enough to allow the Red Ball Express to stand down. The port of Antwerp, after a bitter struggle, had finally been cleared of German defenders, and its facilities were being restored to operation. This shortened the supply line from the coast to the front dramatically. The French railroads, repaired by thousands of American and British engineers working around the clock, began operating on limited but vital schedules. Portable gasoline pipelines, hurriedly laid across France, started delivering fuel directly to forward depots, reducing the reliance on trucks for the most voluminous commodity. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ended its operations after 82 days of relentless, non-stop effort. The drivers, many of them more exhausted than they had ever been in their lives, returned to their original units. Some continued in other, less intense supply operations. Others, as the army grew desperate for infantry replacements during the winter battles, volunteered for transfer to combat roles. As the War Department finally began to accept American volunteers for frontline service in a tentative, limited step toward integration. The final statistics of the Red Ball Express tell a story of achievement that military planners and historians still study with awe. 4,193 tons of supplies delivered, 6,000 trucks operating at the peak, 23,000 drivers and support personnel involved. 75% of them African American. An average of 900 vehicles on the road simultaneously. Distances covered up to 400 miles one way. All of it accomplished in 82 days of continuous, punishing operation. But behind these numbers lies the real, human story of the truck itself. The GMC CCKW, dismissed by British experts in 1940 as an inadequate, flawed design, had proven itself to be arguably the most valuable single tactical vehicle of World War II. Its simplicity, the very characteristic that had once made it seem inferior and crude, was, in the final accounting, its greatest and most enduring strength. Drivers could repair a CCKW with a wrench, a hammer, and a piece of baling wire. Mechanics could keep them running with improvised parts cannibalized from other wrecks. The trucks could be abused, overloaded, driven into the ground, and neglected, and yet they kept functioning. The CCKW's reliability under extreme duress became the stuff of legend. Stories circulated through the motor pools of trucks, running with cracked engine blocks, the cracks sealed with a paste made from sawdust and oil. Of transmissions that should have seized solid continuing to grind through the gears, through sheer mechanical stubbornness. Of trucks that rolled into depots with two flat tires, steam pouring from an overheated radiator, and brakes that were barely functional, delivered their absolutely vital cargo, received the most hasty and rudimentary of repairs, and then rolled out again just hours later to make the run once more. The truck's simple, robust, and straightforward design meant that even a severely damaged vehicle could often be coaxed and cajoled into limping to its destination. General Patton stated flatly to his staff, "The 2.5-ton truck is our most valuable weapon." He understood what many civilians, and even some soldiers, did not. Without supply, armies cease to be armies. Tanks without fuel are static pillboxes. Rifles without ammunition are merely clubs. The most advanced weapons in the world are useless if they cannot be sustained in the field. The humble CCKW truck made modern, mechanized, blitzkrieg-style warfare possible for the Allies by solving the most unglamorous but fundamental problem of all moving the stuff. Colonel John Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander's son and himself a veteran logistics officer, wrote after the war that without the Red Ball truck drivers, the advance across France could not have been made. The trucks, specifically the GMC CCKW, enabled the American forces to maintain a momentum and a tempo of operations that the Germans could not match. Any pause, any hesitation, would have allowed the German defences to solidify. The war, he concluded, might very well have extended into 1946 without this logistic success. In December 1944, the entire concept faced its final, brutal test. German forces launched Operation Wacht am Rhein. The Ardennes offensive, which would become known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last major offensive in the West caught the American forces completely by surprise, punching a deep, dangerous bulge into the Allied lines. The situation demanded a massive, rapid reinforcement and resupply of the beleaguered units fighting in the frozen Ardennes forest. The Red Ball Express was officially over, but the trucks were not. And neither were the drivers. Reformed under different names and designations, the Little Red Ball, the White Ball Express, and others, the great convoy operations resumed almost immediately. The same GMC CCKWs that had supplied Patton's Great Summer Advance now rushed reinforcements and ammunition north to contain the German breakthrough. The same American drivers who had proven their mettle on the dusty roads of August now returned to their cabs in the heart of a European winter, facing conditions that made the summer's problems seem almost trivial by comparison. Snow and ice covered the roads of France and Belgium. Blackout driving became even more perilous. German air attacks actually increased temporarily as the Luftwaffe threw its last reserves into the air to support the Great Offensive. And yet, the trucks rolled. Ammunition reached the besieged American units, holding the key crossroads at Bastogne. Fuel kept the tanks and trucks of the relief forces mobile. Reinforcements arrived in a constant stream to seal the shoulders of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was won by the courage of the combat troops in their frozen foxholes, in their desperate stands at places like Stain, Vith and Elsenborn Ridge, but it was sustained, it was made possible, by the truck drivers who kept the supply lines open through the worst winter weather Europe had seen in decades. The winter operations revealed a whole new set of challenges. Engines froze solid overnight and had to be thawed with carefully built fires under the oil pans before they would start. Ice on the roads made speed limits meaningless as trucks slid and jackknifed regardless of a driver's skill. Snow drifts blocked entire routes, requiring hours of back-breaking digging with shovels to clear a passage for the convoys. Frostbite became a constant danger for drivers in the open cab trucks, which offered minimal protection from the biting cold. Yet, the supply convoys continued, day and night, proving that the logistics system forged in the crucible of the Red Ball Express was robust and adaptable enough to overcome any condition, any obstacle. After Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945, the CCKW continued its service. The trucks that had crossed France in 1944 now became the trucks of the occupation, hauling displaced persons to refugee camps, distributing food to a starving civilian population, and transporting occupation troops across the defeated Reich. Some were shipped to the ongoing war in the Pacific Theater, where they served in the Philippines and Okinawa campaigns. Production of the CCKW continued unabated until 1945, by the time the war ended. General Motors had built more CCKW trucks than Germany had built vehicles of all types combined. The total production figure of approximately 750 units exceeded the entire pre-war truck inventory of most nations on Earth. These trucks served not just the American Army, but were supplied to Allied forces worldwide through Lend-Lease. British, French, Soviet, and Canadian armies all operated large fleets of GMC CCKWs, and all came to appreciate their rugged simplicity. That simplicity translated into a remarkable longevity. CCKWs remained in active American military service through the 1960s. The design was officially succeeded by the M35 series trucks in the 1950s, but older, maintained CCKWs continued in National Guard and reserve units for years afterward. Many were sold as surplus to foreign militaries, where they served reliably into the 1970s and even the 1980s. A fortunate few remain operational today, lovingly restored and maintained by collectors and museums, rolling testaments to a bygone era of industrial might and human endurance. The Red Ball Express drivers, particularly the African-American men who formed its overwhelming majority, received recognition for their Herculean efforts slowly, and often incompletely. The operation itself was publicized during the war, featured in newsreels and magazine articles that played to patriotic fervor. But the racial dimension of the story, the fact that it was largely black soldiers who had accomplished this logistical miracle, was often downplayed, sanitized, or simply ignored in media intended for a segregated American audience. The 1952 film, Red Ball Express, while acknowledging African-American participation, was modified at the insistence of the Department of Defense to show a level of racial integration that simply did not exist in the actual operation of 1944. Many Red Ball veterans returned to an America that was still deeply and violently segregated. Men who had risked their lives daily to supply the fight against fascism in Europe came home to face the same old fascism at home, in the form of discrimination in housing, employment, and basic civil rights. Some used their GI Bill benefits to obtain educations and home loans, though even these hard-earned benefits were often more difficult for African-American veterans to access. Banks frequently refused loans. Universities imposed strict quotas. Employers passed over qualified black veterans in favor of less qualified white applicants. Others found their military service dismissed, forgotten, or actively denigrated. But the story, the truth of what they had done, endured. In the 1980s and 1990s, as historians began a fuller, more honest accounting of the World War II experience, the Red Ball Express and the contributions of African-American soldiers received renewed and long overdue attention. Veteran testimonies were recorded, preserved, and given the weight they deserved. Museums created extensive exhibits documenting the convoy system and the soldiers who made it work. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans features a prominent and moving display on the Red Ball Express, including a beautifully restored GMC CCKW truck and personal accounts from the drivers themselves. James Ruckard, who had served with the 514th Quartermaster Regiment, told a reporter years later, "I'm proud I served. We were young. We were scared. But we did what needed doing. A lot of white folks didn't think black soldiers could handle that kind of responsibility. We proved them wrong. Every supply run that reached the front line on time, that was us proving we deserved respect. That was us fighting for freedom, foreign and domestic." Ruckard's words capture the painful double consciousness of the African-American World War II veteran. They fought for an American victory overseas, while being acutely aware that the America they were returning to denied them full citizenship and basic human dignity. They risked their lives for a nation that segregated them, discriminated against them, and often refused to recognize their contributions. And yet, they served with unyielding distinction, understanding in their hearts that their performance under fire and under immense pressure was a powerful argument in the broader, ongoing struggle for civil rights back home. The Red Ball Express became one more vital chapter in the long and difficult story of African-Americans proving their worth, their courage, and their patriotism to a skeptical and often hostile nation. The technical and doctrinal lessons learned from the Red Ball Express operations influenced American military logistics for decades to come. The concept of continuous supply convoys, of dedicated routes with absolute priority traffic control, and of massive, theater-wide trucking operations became embedded in standard U.S. military doctrine. During the Korean War, similar convoy systems, though on a smaller scale, supplied United Nations forces fighting on the peninsula. In Vietnam, despite the very different terrain and tactical situation, immense truck convoys remained the lifeblood of American operations. To this day, modern military logisticians still study the planning, execution, and sheer scale of the Red Ball Express as a masterclass in operational level supply. The GMC CCKW design itself exerted a profound influence on post-war military truck development across the globe. Its 656 configuration became the standard layout for medium tactical trucks for a generation. The core concept of using mass-produced, easily maintained commercial-based vehicles rather than overly specialized and complex military-only designs became accepted practice in democratic nations. Countries around the world, from France to Japan, either directly copied or heavily adapted CCKW features into their own military truck programs. Soviet designers, who had received thousands of CCKWs through Lend-Lease, studied the trucks with intense interest. Post-war Soviet military trucks, most notably the Zhuil series, show a clear and undeniable influence from the CCKW in their overall layout, capability, and design philosophy. The Soviets, pragmatic above all else, understood that the CCKW's greatest feature was not any single technical specification, but the entire package of adequate performance, breathtaking simplicity of maintenance, and the potential for massive, overwhelming production. Modern military vehicles are, of course, far more sophisticated than the CCKW. They are computerized, equipped with automatic transmissions, central tire inflation systems, and advanced armor protection. But they still face the same fundamental challenge that the CCKW met so brilliantly: how to move vast quantities of supplies reliably under the most demanding combat conditions, while remaining simple and robust enough for field maintenance by young soldiers with basic training. Every military truck designer since 1945 has, in a sense, been working in the long shadow cast by the CCKW, striving to match its near-perfect combination of fundamental capability and uncomplicated, rugged simplicity. The CCKW ultimately proved that excellence in military equipment is not always, or even often, about having the best specifications on a data sheet. The British evaluators in 1940 were, from a purely technical standpoint, correct. The ACKWX was underpowered. It did have handling limitations. Its long wheelbase was awkward on narrow roads. But they were profoundly wrong about what truly mattered in a war of national survival. In a total war, fought by industrial societies, adequate vehicles, produced in overwhelming numbers, will invariably defeat superior vehicles, produced in limited quantities. Trucks that mechanics can repair with a hammer and a wrench in a muddy field will always, in the long run, outperform more sophisticated trucks that require specialized tools, factory-trained technicians, and a steady supply of complex spare parts. In the brutal calculus of war, simplicity is its own highest form of sophistication. The British Army, which had so decisively rejected the ACKWX in 1940, eventually operated many thousands of CCKWs supplied through Lend-Lease. British drivers and mechanics, who had initially been skeptical, came to appreciate the very same characteristics their earlier evaluators had criticized. The long wheelbase that had seemed awkward provided excellent stability when carrying heavy loads. The engine that had seemed underpowered proved to be adequately strong and remarkably reliable over long distances. The simple, almost agricultural design meant that British mechanics, trained on more complex British vehicles that required precision maintenance, could keep the CCKWs running with whatever tools and spare parts they could scrounge. A British transport officer wrote in his after-action report that the American trucks, initially dismissed as rather crude and agricultural, proved in sustained operations to be superior to our own vehicles, which required more sophisticated maintenance. The CCKW's ability to continue functioning despite neglect, abuse, and a lack of proper care made it the ideal vehicle for the chaotic, unpredictable world of combat logistics. British units, by the end of the war, had learned to actively prefer the CCKW over their own designs for long-haul missions under the most difficult conditions. The story of the GMC CCKW and the Red Ball Express is, in its final analysis, a story about what truly wins wars. It is not about the most advanced technology, or the most impressive performance specifications, or the vehicles that look most impressive in promotional photographs or official demonstrations. What wins wars is reliable, adequate equipment produced in quantities so vast they simply overwhelm the enemy's capacity to respond. It is about that equipment being operated by determined, resilient people who understand, with every fibre of their being, that their mission matters, that lives depend on their success. The CCKW was not the best truck of World War II in any technical sense. It was merely adequate. But adequate trucks, by the hundreds of thousands, driven by men who were willing to work until they collapsed from exhaustion, supplied the most successful military campaign in modern history. The humble 2.5-ton truck, dismissed as practically worthless by British experts in 1940, became the steel lifeline that sustained the Allied armies from the beaches of Normandy all the way to the Elbe River. And the drivers, 75% of them African, American soldiers fighting for a country that still legally denied them their basic civil rights, proved for all time that excellence, courage, and determination know no racial boundary. They kept the trucks rolling when any pause, any hesitation, meant that American soldiers at the front might run out of the ammunition to defend themselves, or the fuel to continue the advance. They drove through exhaustion, through fear, through discrimination and prejudice, because the mission, the ultimate mission of defeating tyranny, was more important than their personal comfort, their safety, or their desire for recognition. These men returned home to a nation that had not yet fully recognized their humanity, or their citizenship. Many faced the same hatred and discrimination they had known before the war. But they had proven something essential and unshakable. They had demonstrated, under the most demanding conditions imaginable, that American soldiers could handle the most complex and critical of missions. They had shown the world that segregation was a lie, that ability and heroism have absolutely nothing to do with the color of a man's skin. The Red Ball Express, and the thousands of American men who made it work, became part of the great, accumulating body of evidence that would eventually, painstakingly, help to dismantle the oppressive system of Jim Crow segregation in the decades that followed the war. On August 25, 1944, Sergeant William Henderson finally bent down, picked up his grease-stained wrench from the cobblestones, and slid it back into his tool roll. He had finished tightening the last bolt on a CCKW engine, and he stood watching as the truck, driven by a young American soldier who couldn't have been more than 19, rumbled out of the maintenance bay to join the endless convoy forming outside. The British had said these trucks were worthless. But Henderson, wiping his hands on an oily rag, knew better. He knew with the certainty of a man who understood machines, and the men who drove them, that in the next 82 days, these supposedly inadequate vehicles would write themselves into history. Not through dramatic combat action or technological superiority, but through simple, stubborn, unglamorous, essential work. The work of hauling supplies, the work of keeping armies moving, the work of winning a war. The GMC CCKW, the Jimmy, the Deuce and a half, the truck. It was the vehicle the British rejected, the machine that became America's secret weapon. It was the lifeline of the Red Ball Express. It is lasting proof that sometimes, in the darkest of hours. The most valuable things in the world are the simplest ones, operated by ordinary people who are absolutely determined to get the job done, no matter the cost.